Shoko Asahara, the blind guru, who built a death cult. Shoko Asahara was born as Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955 in Japan. His early life was unremarkable. Born into a poor family, he suffered from partial blindness due to childhood illness. He was sent to a special school for the visually impaired, where he learned how to manipulate others, often bullying weaker students while pretending to be a spiritual leader. As a young man, he tried and failed to become a doctor. Instead, he studied herbal medicine and acupuncture, eventually opening a small pharmacy in the 1970s. However, his business collapsed after he was caught selling illegal medicine, forcing him to find a new way to make money. By the 1980s, Japan was experiencing a wave of spiritual and self-improvement movements. Seeing an opportunity, he started teaching yoga and meditation. He built a following by mixing elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic Christianity. His group, Aum Shinrikyo, attracted educated professionals, including scientists and engineers. Over time, Asahara began claiming he had supernatural powers and that he was the only true path to salvation. His paranoia grew, and he started warning his followers of an impending global catastrophe, telling them they had to prepare for the end of the world. As his influence expanded, he sought legitimacy by entering politics. In 1990, he formed the Shinri-2 Supreme Truth Party and ran for office in Japan's elections. He and his followers dressed in matching outfits and campaigned aggressively, believing they would gain political power. But when they failed miserably, Asahara became enraged. He declared democracy a failure, claiming that his enemies had rigged the system against him. This marked a turning point. He abandoned politics and turned Aum Shinrikyo into a violent, apocalyptic cult. Believing that the world was corrupt and had rejected him, he became obsessed with building weapons. His followers, many of whom were skilled scientists, helped him develop biological and chemical weapons. The cult began experimenting with deadly gases and poisons, attacking dissidents and defectors. By the mid-1990s, Asahara had fully embraced terrorism as a means to achieve his vision of a purified world under his rule. On March 20, 1995, his cult carried out one of the worst terrorist attacks in Japanese history. During the morning rush hour, Aum Shinrikyo members released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, killing 13 people and injuring thousands. The attack shocked Japan and led to an intensive police investigation. Within months, authorities raided the cult's compounds, discovering stockpiles of weapons, chemicals, and evidence of planned future attacks. Asahara was arrested and put on trial. His once loyal followers abandoned him, and he was sentenced to death. After years on death row, he was executed in 2018. His rise and fall illustrate how an ordinary man, seeking influence through politics, transformed into a cult leader and terrorist, leading his movement to destruction. Adolf Hitler, from failed artist to a cult of personality, Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in Austria. As a child, he dreamed of becoming a famous artist, but reality did not match his ambitions. Twice he applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, and twice he was rejected. These failures deeply humiliated him, and he began blaming others for his misfortunes. During this time, he lived in Vienna, struggling with poverty, and was exposed to the city's rising wave of anti-Semitism and radical politics. Although he had no political ambitions at the time, the ideas he absorbed in these years shaped his worldview. In 1914, World War I broke out, and Hitler volunteered for the German army. For the first time in his life, he found purpose and structure. He served as a messenger on the front lines and was wounded in battle. When Germany lost the war in 1918, he was devastated. Like many German soldiers, he believed in the stab-in-the-back myth, a conspiracy theory that blamed Jews, socialists, and corrupt politicians for Germany's defeat, rather than its military failures. This idea would later become central to his ideology. After the war, Germany was in chaos. The economy was collapsing, political violence was rampant, and people were desperate for leadership. Hitler, now in his early 30s, had no career, no family, and no direction. But fate gave him an opportunity. In 1919, while working as a government informant, he was sent to spy on a small nationalist group called the German Workers' Party, DAP. Instead of reporting on them, he was drawn to their ideas. The party's leaders recognized his speaking talent and encouraged him to join. Within a year, he became their most powerful figure. In 1920, he rebranded the group as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, and adopted the swastika as its symbol. Hitler's speeches were electrifying, drawing large crowds. He told Germans they were a superior race, victims of betrayal, and destined to rule the world. He demonized Jews, communists, and democracy itself, portraying them as enemies preventing Germany from achieving greatness. By 1923, Hitler believed he was ready to seize power. Inspired by Mussolini's recent march on Rome, he attempted a coup in Munich, known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The plan failed miserably, and Hitler was arrested. But prison became his launching pad. While serving a short sentence, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his vision for Germany and his obsession with racial purity. When he was released in 1924, he had a clear strategy. He would no longer try to seize power by force, but would win through legal means. Over the next few years, the Nazi Party slowly gained support, but it remained on the fringe. Everything changed with the Great Depression in 1929. Germany's economy collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, and millions lost faith in democracy. The Nazis exploited this crisis, promising jobs, stability, and a return to German glory. By 1932, they became the largest party in the Reichstag, German parliament. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Many politicians believed they could control him, but they underestimated his ability to manipulate and destroy opposition. Within months, he used the Reichstag fire as a pretext to eliminate civil liberties. He blamed communists for the fire, arrested thousands of political opponents, and passed the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial powers. Now fully in control, Hitler transformed Germany into a totalitarian state. The Nazi Party became the only legal political party, and all opposition was crushed. He created a cult of personality, portraying himself as the nation's savior. Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, ensured that his image was everywhere. People were taught to view him as an infallible leader. The famous greeting Heil Hitler became mandatory, and children were indoctrinated in schools. By 1939, Hitler had rebuilt Germany's military, violating the Treaty of Versailles. He had already annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. But his ambitions were far greater. He wanted to create a vast German empire, free of Jews, Slavs, and anyone he deemed inferior. That year, he invaded Poland, triggering World War II. At first, Germany achieved stunning victories, conquering much of Europe in a matter of months. But as the war dragged on, Hitler's overconfidence became his downfall. His invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 proved disastrous. He ignored warnings, believing his ideology made Germans superior to Russians. By 1943, the tide had turned, and Germany was losing. Meanwhile, his policies led to one of history's greatest crimes, the Holocaust. Convinced that Jews were the source of all problems, he ordered their systematic extermination. Over 6 million Jews were murdered, along with millions of others deemed undesirable. By 1945, Germany was in ruins. Allied forces were closing in, and Hitler was trapped in his bunker in Berlin. Despite the destruction, He refused to surrender, still believing in victory. As Soviet troops entered the city, he realized there was no escape. On April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide, shooting himself while his wife, Eva Braun, took poison. His body was later burned by his loyalists to prevent capture. The Nazi regime collapsed, and Germany was divided. Hitler's movement had led to the deaths of millions, the destruction of entire cities, and the complete humiliation of Germany. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12 years, ending in devastation. Hitler's rise and fall remain a stark warning of how a failed artist, fueled by resentment and radical politics, can turn into a leader of a fanatical political cult that destroys everything in its path. Charles Manson, from failed musician to cult leader. Charles Manson was born in 1934 to a teenage mother who had little interest in raising him. His early life was filled with instability, neglect, and crime. By the time he was a teenager, he was already involved in theft, fraud, and other petty crimes. He spent much of his youth in reform schools and later in prison. Despite his troubled past, he was intelligent and highly manipulative, able to charm people and make them believe he had a deeper understanding of the world. In the 1960s, America was undergoing a cultural revolution. The hippie movement, which preached peace, love, and rejection of mainstream society, was in full swing. Manson saw an opportunity to reinvent himself. He moved to San Francisco, where he adopted the persona of a charismatic spiritual guru, preaching a mix of hippie philosophy, mysticism, and his own bizarre interpretations of Christianity and the occult. He spoke about an impending apocalyptic race war which he called helter-skelter, a term he took from a Beatles song. He told his followers that black people would rise up against white society, but because they were incapable of ruling, they would turn to him as their leader. Manson wasn't just a cult leader, he wanted to be a rock star. In Los Angeles, he surrounded himself with young, vulnerable followers, most of whom were women. He used a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and group sex rituals to break down their identities and rebuild them in his image. His followers became completely devoted, willing to do anything he asked. At one point, Manson tried to launch a music career, befriending music producer Terry Melcher, the son of actress Doris Day. Manson believed Melcher would make him famous. When that failed, he became bitter and enraged, feeling that the world had rejected him. This was a turning point. His focus shifted from trying to gain fame to bringing about the apocalypse he had been preaching. By 1969, Manson believed it was time to ignite helter-skelter. He ordered his followers to commit brutal murders in an attempt to start the race war he had been predicting. On August 8, 1969, he sent members of his cult, now known as the Manson family, to the home of actress Sharon Tate, the pregnant wife of film director Roman Polanski. Manson had chosen the house because it once belonged to Terry Melcher. His followers, under orders, broke in and murdered Tate and 4 others in one of the most shocking crimes in American history. The next night, they murdered Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, following similar instructions from Manson. The murders were savage, with messages like death to pigs and helter-skelter written in blood on the walls. The brutal killing sent shockwaves through America. The hippie movement, once associated with peace and love, suddenly seemed dark and dangerous. People feared that anyone could be brainwashed into violence. Manson and his followers were arrested later that year. During the trial, Manson showed his control over his cult, as his followers continued to defend him and even threatened the judge. He used theatrics, carving an X into his forehead, which later turned into a swastika, and making bizarre statements in court. The trial became a media sensation, symbolizing the dark side of the 1960s counterculture. In 1971, Manson was sentenced to death, but when California abolished the death penalty, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. He remained in prison, until his death in 2017, still holding influence over a small group of devoted admirers. Manson's story is a chilling example of how a failed musician, rejected by society, used politics, race tensions, and counterculture movements to build a cult that led to some of the most infamous murders in history. You're right to call that out. It wasn't the full 5,000 characters. Let me expand it properly to meet the required length. Here's the full 5,000 character version of Sun Myung Moon's rise and fall. Sun Myung Moon, the businessman who built a religious empire. Sun Myung Moon was born in 1920 in a small village in what is now North Korea. His family was Christian, which was rare in the region, as Korea was largely influenced by Buddhism and Confucianism. From a young age, Moon showed deep interest in religion and spirituality, but he was not an ordinary believer. He claimed that at the age of 15 he had a vision of Jesus Christ, in which Jesus told him that he had failed to complete his mission on earth. Jesus supposedly chose Moon as his successor, tasking him with establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth and uniting all religions under one truth. This claim set Moon apart from traditional Christian leaders. Unlike pastors who followed the Bible, Moon believed he was rewriting Christianity itself. He was not just a preacher, he saw himself as the new Messiah. In the 1940s, Moon's religious ideas became more radical. He started teaching that he and his future wife would become the true parents of all humanity, meaning they would create a sinless human lineage. According to him, Eve had sex with Satan in the Garden of Eden, corrupting humanity. To fix this, a new Adam and Eve needed to emerge and spiritually cleanse the world. He declared that only by following him could people achieve salvation. However, his ideas clashed with the communist regime in North Korea. He was arrested in 1947 for spreading anti-government teachings and spent years in a brutal North Korean labor camp. He survived starvation and torture, but in 1950, he was freed when UN forces bombed the camp during the Korean War. This event convinced him that he was truly chosen by God. After escaping to South Korea, he founded the Unification Church in 1954. The church grew quickly, attracting thousands of followers who believed in his teachings about purity, salvation, and world unification. Moon built a strict hierarchical system in which he had absolute authority over his followers' lives. By the 1960s, Moon started expanding his movement beyond Korea. He believed his mission was global, and he set his sights on Japan and the United States, two of the world's most powerful nations. During the Cold War, anti-communism was a powerful force, and Moon used this to his advantage. He presented himself as a warrior against communism, gaining the support of conservatives who saw him as a valuable ally. His church donated money to right-wing causes, including military efforts to fight communism in Vietnam, Latin America, and even Africa. This political stance made him useful to world leaders, especially in the United States. In the 1970s, Moon moved to the U.S. and started recruiting young Americans, particularly hippies and college students disillusioned with mainstream society. His recruiters targeted people who were searching for purpose, offering them a new family in the church. However, once inside, members were isolated from their real families, subjected to intense indoctrination, and forced to dedicate themselves completely to Moon. One of the most controversial aspects of the Unification Church was its mass-arranged marriages. Moon believed that marriages should not be based on personal attraction, but rather on God's will, which only he could determine. He would personally select marriage partners for his followers, often matching people from different races and nationalities to create a unified world. In 1982, he officiated a mass wedding of over 2,000 couples in Madison Square Garden, New York. These ceremonies became the church's signature event, with later weddings including tens of thousands of couples. As his influence grew, so did his business empire. Moon used his church's funds to create a multi-billion-dollar network of businesses, including newspapers, factories, real estate, and even an arms manufacturing company. In the United States, he founded the Washington Times, a conservative newspaper that became highly influential in right-wing politics. He also established connections with U.S. presidents, including Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, who saw him as a key supporter of anti-communist policies. But Moon's success didn't last forever. In the 1980s, the U.S. government began investigating him for financial crimes. In 1984, he was convicted of tax evasion and conspiracy, leading to an 18-month prison sentence. His followers believed this was religious persecution, but to the outside world, it was evidence that his empire was built on fraud. Despite his imprisonment, the Unification Church continued to operate. Moon expanded his influence in South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe, using his wealth to gain political connections. He even met with Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, despite having once been a staunch anti-communist. This showed that his true goal was not ideology, it was power. As he aged, Moon became more authoritarian and unpredictable. He declared himself the King of Peace, claiming that all world leaders should bow to him. He also crowned himself and his wife in a bizarre ceremony inside the U.S. Capitol, an event that shocked many American politicians. His followers continued to see him as the Messiah, but the outside world increasingly viewed him as a cult leader, drunk on his own power. Moon died in 2012 at the age of 92. After his death, his family and followers fought over control of his empire. His wife, children, and closest disciples split into rival factions, each claiming to be the true successor of his mission. Some of his sons created their own religious movements, while others focused on controlling the church's business empire. Today, the Unification Church still exists, but it is a fragmented shadow of its former self. Moon's dream of ruling the world never came true, and his name is now more associated with cult practices, brainwashing, and financial scandals than with spiritual enlightenment. Sun Myung Moon's story is a prime example of how an ordinary man used faith, nationalism, and politics to build a global empire, only for it to collapse under its own contradictions. His life was one of power, ambition, and control, showing how dangerous it can be when religion and politics become one. David Koresh, the cult leader who declared himself the Lamb of God. David Koresh was born as Vernon Wayne Howell in 1959 in Texas. His childhood was marked by instability. His mother was only 14 years old when she had him, and his father abandoned them before he was even born. His stepfather was abusive, and he struggled with learning disabilities in school, making him an outcast. However, despite his academic struggles, he had a remarkable ability to memorize the Bible and developed a deep interest in religion. As a teenager, Koresh became obsessed with prophecy, divine visions, and apocalyptic themes. By his early 20s, he joined the Branch Davidians, a small breakaway group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church based in Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians believed that the end of the world was near, and that a new Messiah would lead God's chosen people to salvation. Koresh saw this as his chance to rise to power. In the early 1980s, he tried to take control of the group, but was forced out after a failed leadership challenge. He traveled to Israel, claiming he had received divine revelations. When he returned, he was more determined than ever. By 1987, he managed to overthrow the previous leader, Lois Roden, and take full control of the Branch Davidians. He changed his name to David Koresh, symbolizing that he was a new King David, chosen by God to be the leader of his people. Under Koresh's rule, the Branch Davidians transformed from a small religious sect into an apocalyptic cult. He claimed to have a direct line to God, and his teachings became more extreme. He told his followers that he alone could interpret the book of Revelation, and that he was the Lamb of God mentioned in the Bible, meaning that only through him could people be saved. Koresh also introduced polygamy into the group, claiming that God had instructed him to take multiple wives, including young teenage girls. He declared that all marriages within the group were invalid except for his own, and that only he could have children because his offspring would be divine. Men were forbidden from sleeping with their wives, while Koresh fathered children with multiple women. By the early 1990s, he was preparing his followers for the final battle between good and evil. He started stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and explosives, believing that the U.S. government was the enemy of God and that they would soon come for him. He preached that his followers must be ready to die for their faith. The authorities began investigating him after reports surfaced of child abuse, illegal weapons stockpiling, and sexual exploitation inside the compound. In 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, attempted to raid the Branch Davidian compound, believing Koresh was running an illegal arms operation. However, the raid ended in disaster. A gunfight broke out, killing 4 federal agents and 6 Branch Davidians. After this, the FBI took over the situation, leading to a 51-day standoff. During this time, Koresh refused to surrender, claiming that he was waiting for a divine sign from God. He told the authorities that the world was ending and that he and his followers would rather die than submit to the government. On April 19, 1993, the FBI launched an assault on the compound, using tear gas to try and force the followers out. A fire broke out, engulfing the entire building. To this day, it is unclear whether the fire was started by Koresh's followers or caused by the FBI's actions, but the result was catastrophic. 76 people, including women and children, burned to death inside. Koresh's charred body was later found with a gunshot wound, suggesting he either took his own life or was killed by one of his followers. The Waco tragedy remains one of the most controversial government operations in U.S. history. Koresh had successfully turned a small religious group into an apocalyptic political cult, leading them into a deadly confrontation with the government that ended in flames. His story is a warning of how charisma, prophecy, and paranoia can turn a man into a leader and lead his followers to their deaths.